They warned her she would die if she tried. In the heart of Montana's wilderness, a massive black stallion, an animal feared as untamable, savage and dangerous, thrashed in a snare of barbed wire. Rangers shouted from a safe distance, rifles were raised, and every human instinct screamed to get back, to run, to let the beast destroy itself. But Claire Donovan, a lone wildlife officer, stepped forward when no one else dared. What followed was not an act of recklessness. It was a moment so unthinkable it would challenge everything we believe about fear, trust, and the fragile bridge between the world of man and the heart of the wild. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Montana plains, washing the wilderness in a pale, weak gold. Heat shimmered off the tall grasses, their tips swaying lazily under a faint wind that carried the dry scent of dust and sage. Overhead, a single hawk wheeled in slow, lazy circles, its cry sharp and lonely, echoing across the vast, empty expanse of the sky. At first glance, the scene looked timeless, almost peaceful. One of those quiet moments in the Montana Wilderness Preserve when the entire world seems to hold its breath. But that calm fractured in an instant. A piercing scream split the air. It wasn't human, it was the high, raw shriek of a horse in pure agony. Birds exploded upward from the brush in a frantic flurry of wings, scattering like buckshot against the fading light. Visitors on the main trail froze, their chatter cut short, heads turning toward the terrible sound. The cry came again, this time louder, more desperate, a sound that rattled the nerves of everyone within earshot. It was the kind of sound that scraped down your spine, impossible to ignore. People began to run. Rangers, volunteers, tourists with cameras still dangling from their necks. Everyone converged toward the fence line on the preserve's western edge, a place most people avoided. Dust rose with their hurried steps, and nervous, uncertain voices filled the air. Then they saw him. Midnight. The giant black stallion was a living legend on the preserve, spoken of only in hushed, fearful tones. His body was a fortress of muscle, his mane a wild cascade of tangled onyx, his temper as unpredictable as lightning on the open plain. Few dared to approach him, even under the most controlled circumstances. To most, he was a creature best admired from a great distance, an untamable, unyielding, brute force of the wild. Now he was thrashing like a demon caught in a trap from hell. One of his front legs had slipped through a gap in an old barbed wire fence, a forgotten section left over from before the preserve's expansion. The wire had twisted tight around his pastern, digging deep into his flesh with every frantic, panicked pull. Blood slicked his leg, dripping down in dark rivulets to stain the dry dirt below. Each violent movement only drove the barbs deeper, cutting crueler, and the stallion screamed again, throwing his head back, his massive body convulsing in a storm of fury and fear. The sight was chaos made flesh. His hooves pounded the ground like hammers, rattling the old wooden posts until they quivered. Dust erupted in choking clouds, mixed with the metallic clang of wire straining against an unrelenting, impossible force. Every slam of his hoof sent vibrations through the very souls of those watching, a primal reminder of his sheer, terrifying power. "God Almighty," someone whispered. A woman clutched her child closer and backed away, her face pale. Visitors stumbled backward in a growing panic. Phones rose to record the horror, but even those holding them knew instinctively they were far too close. Several tourists screamed when Midnight lashed out, his hoof striking sparks off a stone. Rangers began shouting, corralling people behind a makeshift boundary, waving their arms frantically to keep them back. "Clear the area. Everyone behind the markers. He'll kill someone if he breaks loose. Move." Fear rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. No one needed convincing. They had all heard the stories of the stallion's fury, how he had kicked straight through a steel gate, how no handler on earth could hold him. To see him now, trapped and enraged, was to stare at violence waiting to be unleashed. "He's a devil," one man muttered, his voice trembling. "No one can get near that beast." Another answered, his voice shaking, "If anyone tries, they're as good as dead." The atmosphere thickened with a heavy, suffocating dread. Time seemed to stretch, every scream of the horse amplifying the awful knowledge that with each passing second the situation worsened. Midnight was destroying himself in his panic, cutting deeper and deeper into his own flesh. The longer they waited, the greater the risk of irreversible damage, of him bleeding out, of death. Still, no one dared to step forward. Then came the sound of heavy boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. Samuel Hayes, the preserve's director, pushed through the line of staff, his face red, his chest heaving. Hayes was a man built of pure authority and tension, every inch of him carved by years of responsibility for this land and the creatures within it. Sweat streaked his temples as his eyes locked on the thrashing stallion. "Hold the line," he barked, his voice booming across the chaotic scene. "Where's the veterinary team?" "5 minutes out, sir," a ranger shouted back, his voice barely audible above the horses' tortured cries. "Keep everyone behind the perimeter," Hayes ordered. "No one, and I mean no one, crosses that fence. You hear me?" The staff echoed back in a ragged unison, though their voices shook with fear. Hayes turned, scanning the crowd, and his eyes narrowed as he spotted a familiar figure pushing closer to the front. "Donovan," he snapped. Ranger Claire Donovan had already slipped past a couple of her colleagues, her hand unconsciously resting on the pair of heavy wire cutters strapped to her belt. The look on her face was grim, her jaw set like stone. "Claire, you step back right now," Hayes thundered. "Wait for the team. That's an order." His words rang with both fury and a deep rattling fear, because if anyone on his staff was reckless enough to ignore him, it was her. Claire's stubborn streak was as notorious as her competence. He had seen it far too many times before, but Claire didn't flinch at his voice. Her gaze was fixed on Midnight. From where she stood, she could see the stallion's rolling eyes, wide with sheer terror, the froth at his mouth, the violent tremor in his massive chest as he gasped for air. More than that, she saw the raw, unadulterated pain. Beneath the rage, beneath the power, there was a suffering that clawed at her gut. She knew what the others didn't see, or refused to see. If they waited another 5 minutes, it might be too late. Horses could bleed out in minutes, or worse, go into shock from the stress and die right there on their feet. Midnight wasn't just in trouble. He was on the brink of death. Claire's breath came quick and sharp. For 7 years she had walked these plains as a ranger, dedicating her life to the fragile balance of life out here. She had broken up fights between bull elk, rescued fawns from canyons, and faced down blizzards that could kill a man in minutes. She wasn't reckless by nature, but when a life dangled on a knife's edge, she could never stand idle. And now the most dangerous horse in the entire preserve was dangling on that very edge. She clenched her jaw and took a step forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Claire, don't!" one of her fellow rangers cried out. "Are you insane? He'll tear you apart," shouted another. Hayes roared into the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Donovan, fall back. That's a direct order." But Claire didn't stop. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she moved past the warning markers, crossing the invisible boundary between safety and certain violent risk. The dust clung to her face as she advanced, the stallion's screams battering her ears, the ground trembling beneath each strike of his hooves. She tightened her grip on the cutters at her side, the cool metal anchoring her resolve. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to those closest to her. "If I walk away, he dies," she said. "I won't let that happen." Behind her, chaos surged. Some staff shouted, some cursed. A tourist muttered a prayer under his breath. Hayes cursed aloud, his fists clenched white at his sides. Still, Claire pressed on. Step by step, she drew closer to the whirlwind of fury and blood. Midnight's massive frame loomed larger with each pace, his muscles rippling like angry waves under his slick, dark coat. He reared again, screaming to the sky, his silhouette a terrifying figure against the dying light. But Claire did not falter. She moved with the steady, deliberate calm of someone who understood that fear had no place here. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, to flee from the waves of pure danger radiating off the animal. But beneath that fear was something else, an unshakable conviction. She could not, would not abandon him to his pain. And so, with the whole preserve watching, holding its collective breath, Claire Donovan stepped into the storm. The cries of protest from behind her blurred into meaningless noise, fading beneath the hammering of her own heartbeat and the thunder of the stallion's hooves. The space between the outer safety line and the animal was narrow, just a strip of ground most people would never dare to enter. Now it felt like walking into the mouth of a hurricane. Her eyes never left Midnight. She kept her body low, her posture steady, avoiding any sudden movements that could be seen as a threat. The massive stallion's dark eyes rolled wildly, the whites flashing in raw panic, but she forced herself to meet his gaze whenever she could. Sweat trickled down her temples, stinging her eyes, but she didn't blink. Her hand hovered near her hip, fingers gripping the handles of the heavy steel cutters, the tool dangling like the only lifeline she had left. Claire stopped. "You'll get yourself killed," someone shouted. Another voice added, high with terror, "Get back!" The words sliced through the air, but fell away from her mind. All she could hear was the ragged, furious snorting of the horse. All she could feel was the tremor of the ground with every violent strike of his hooves. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Still, she pressed forward, step by deliberate step, until she was close enough to taste the dust his hooves kicked up, close enough to smell the blood. Midnight was a whirlwind of terror and fury. His muscles rippled like coiled cables beneath his black coat, slick with sweat and blood. His mane whipped across his neck as he tossed his head, his eyes blazing with a red-rimmed madness. The barbed wire clung to his leg like a trap forged from hell itself, the sharp strands biting deeper with every single lunge. Blood soaked the hair around the wound, dripping into the dust in thick, crimson spatters. Each desperate jerk sent another spray of droplets fanning outward, the metallic scent cutting sharply through the hot Montana air. The sound was unbearable. Hooves smashed against the ground with such force the earth itself seemed to shudder. Wooden posts groaned, rattling against the pull of the twisted fence. Metal scraped and shrieked as if the land itself was protesting the stallion's torment. With every violent thrash, the barbs tightened their hold, shredding flesh and muscle, promising only ruin if this went on for much longer. Claire's stomach twisted at the sight. She had seen wounds before, she had seen animals in pain, but never like this. If they waited even another few minutes, the wire could slice clean through his tendons. Midnight would cripple himself, bleed out, or collapse into shock. Either way, he would die a horrible, lonely death. She dropped to her knees. The dust rose around her in a cloud, clinging to her skin, to the sweat on her brow. She drew out the cutters with both hands, the steel catching the dying light of day. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to back away, that she was too close now, that one wrong move, one misplaced hoof, could end her life in a single brutal instant. She ignored them all. "Easy," she whispered, the word meant for herself as much as for the beast before her. She pressed the cutters against the first strand of wire. The sharp steel jaws closed, and with a hard squeeze, there was a loud snap. The sound rang out like a gunshot. For a single heartbeat, an eerie silence followed. Then the horse screamed, the noise tearing through the air like ripping fabric. Midnight reared against the fresh wave of pain, blood spraying as the severed barb snapped free. The hot liquid spattered against Claire's hands, dark and slick, mixing with her sweat until her palms were slippery. Her breath caught in her throat, but she steadied her grip. A bead of sweat slid down her face, falling onto the dirt between them, a tiny dark spot on the ground already painted with the stallion's blood. Her vision blurred, but she blinked it clear, locking onto the next strand of wire. Midnight lashed out, his head flying. His roar of pain shook her to her bones, but she held her ground, her eyes fixed low, never challenging him, never daring to show a hint of fear. She squeezed the cutters again. Snap. The second strand gave way. The stallion's entire body convulsed. He kicked out violently, the ground quaking under the force of the strike. The air shook with his fury, dust blasting against Claire's face. He nearly collided with her, a near miss that would have been fatal. But she held steady, gritting her teeth, moving only to angle herself lower, making herself less of a target, less threatening. Her entire world narrowed to the wires, the blood and the living storm thrashing just inches in front of her. Behind her, the chaos boiled over. Dr. Melissa Carter, the preserve's chief veterinarian, stood 30 paces back, sweat trickling down her temple. The tranquilizer rifle in her hands trembled, the barrel wavering. Her voice cracked as she called out, "One more step and I'll have to fire, Claire. Do you understand me?" From the other side, Samuel Hayes bellowed into a megaphone, his voice straining with desperation. "Claire, stop this madness. That's a direct order. Fall back now." But Claire didn't seem to hear him. Other rangers had unfurled heavy nets, positioning themselves at the ready, their faces pale and drawn. The visitors stood frozen behind the tape line, their phones raised high, some capturing video, others simply clinging to each other in sheer terror. A little girl sobbed against her mother's leg. No one breathed. The dust swirled thick around Claire as she pressed the cutters against another strand, her chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. She felt it then, the vibration of the stallion's very heartbeat pulsing through the ground itself. The rhythm was frantic, a wild drumming against her knees, pressed into the earth. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible, trembling yet steady enough to carry. "If I leave him like this, he dies," she murmured, as though confessing a deep secret to herself. "I can't. I won't." Her words drifted just far enough that Melissa caught them. The vet's lips parted in shock. Hayes swore aloud, slamming a fist against the hood of a nearby vehicle. "You're insane, Claire," a ranger yelled from the sidelines. But then something unexpected happened. For a brief, impossible heartbeat, Midnight paused. His massive body heaved, breath sawing in and out of his chest like a rusty blade. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, flicked downward at the woman crouched beneath him. For just a fraction of a second he hesitated. Not in surrender, not in peace, but in something that looked shockingly like confusion. Claire seized the moment. She shoved the cutters around the next coil of barbed wire and wrenched them closed with all her strength. Snap! The wire recoiled like a snake. Blood sprayed again, hot and wet against her wrists. Midnight jerked violently, lunging forward with a guttural roar. His massive head swung down so close she felt the hot gust of his breath across her cheek. For a split second she thought it was over. One strike and her skull would be crushed like an eggshell. But the stallion jerked back instead, retreating into his own world of agony. Claire gasped for breath, sweat and blood mingling down her arms. She wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve, smearing a streak of red across her face. She couldn't stop now. She was too close. Her cutters bit into the fourth strand. Midnight screamed, rearing again, a terrifying black silhouette against the sky. His hooves sliced through the air just inches from her face. The crowd shrieked, several people ducking instinctively as if the blow were aimed at them. Claire ducked aside, rolling her shoulder, narrowly avoiding a kick that would have ended her life instantly. She hit the dirt, her chest heaving, but she didn't fall back. Instead, she crawled right back toward him, cutters in hand, her eyes fixed on the next glistening wire. Around her, the world seemed to dissolve into silence. Every eye was locked on the tiny figure kneeling before the black titan. A woman against a mountain of rage. A tourist began to cry openly. Another clasped his hands in prayer. Even the hardened rangers fell into a tense, awestruck stillness, unable to look away. Hayes's voice broke the quiet, ragged and hoarse. "You're signing your own death warrant, Donovan," he muttered into his radio, though the words carried into the strange stillness. Dr. Carter's eyes narrowed, her hands tightening around the tranquilizer rifle. She whispered to no one in particular, "Just a few more minutes, and I can put him under safely." But then she added, her voice barely audible, "But I don't think he has a few more minutes left." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Claire pressed the cutters closed again, her knuckles white, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Snap! Another strand gave way. Blood flowed more freely now, soaking the earth beneath the stallion's mangled leg. Midnight screamed to the heavens, but even as he lashed out, he staggered, weakened from the prolonged fight. Claire shifted to the side, narrowly dodging as he lunged, then steadied herself again, dirt and blood streaking her arms and face. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear nothing else. Her body trembled with a flood of adrenaline, but her resolve held firm. She raised the cutters one last time, and in that moment the whole preserve seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this reckless, insane act would end in triumph or in bloody tragedy. The cutters bit down one final time. With a sharp, dry snap, the last strand of barbed wire gave way. The sound cracked through the air like the breaking of a bone. Midnight froze, his massive frame trembling, his ears flicking back in confusion. The tension in the fence went slack. The cruel tangle of wire hung loose and broken around his leg. For a single heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the stallion shifted, testing his freedom. He pulled his leg back, slow and tentative, as though unsure if the trap still held him. The freed limb shook violently, muscles spasming, blood dripping down in thick rivulets. His hoof hovered above the ground for a long moment before finally touching down, unsteady, trembling beneath his own immense weight. Crimson drops spattered against the dirt, dark stains spreading across the pale dust. A hoarse, guttural cry tore from his throat, less a scream of rage than one of utter exhaustion. His chest heaved, his flanks quivering, the whites of his eyes stark and wild against the black of his face. And then, impossibly, he stilled. The crowd behind the fence, the rangers with nets in hand, the veterinarian with her finger trembling on the trigger of her rifle, everyone watched in stunned, silent disbelief as the most feared horse on the entire preserve simply stopped. Claire held her breath, her body locked in place. She remained kneeling in the dust, the cutters still clutched in her hands, every muscle taut with the certainty that one wrong move, one sudden sound would still mean her death. The world felt as if it had folded into silence. The only sound was the heavy, rasping exhale of the stallion before her. Time slowed. Dust motes floated in the low golden light, hanging in the air like tiny particles of gold. The air was thick, electric, every eye waiting for the inevitable explosion, the strike, the charge, the fatal kick that had to be coming. But the explosion never came. Instead, Midnight's enormous head lowered. His dark eyes narrowed, not with rage but with something else entirely, something Claire couldn't name. She released the cutters. They slipped from her trembling hands and fell into the dirt with a dull, soft clatter. The gesture was deliberate, her only way of showing him that she no longer carried anything sharp, anything that could harm him. Her palms opened slowly, empty. Her breath caught as she lifted her gaze. For the first time, her eyes met his fully, without the haze of panic or fury between them. Those eyes, they were bloodshot, yes, and rimmed with pain, but beyond the fury, there was a depth she hadn't expected. They burned with an intelligence that unsettled her, an awareness that made her throat tighten. For a moment, she felt as if he could see right through her, peeling back every layer of her being until nothing remained but the raw, honest truth of who she was. It was not the gaze of a mindless beast. It was the gaze of something that understood suffering and impossibly recognized it in others. Claire's lungs ached. She began to ease backward, every muscle in her body screaming for distance, for safety. One step, she told herself, just one step, then another. But before she could move, the stallion shifted. The immense neck bent lower. Midnight's mane, wild, tangled, and heavy with sweat, slid forward, brushing against her shoulder. The coarse strands grazed her skin, prickling and hot with the warmth of his body. His forehead hovered so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, the rhythm of his breath puffing against the side of her face. Not a shove, not a blow, not violence, just contact. The simplest touch, fleeting and impossibly delicate, from a creature who could have destroyed her in an instant. Claire's heart stopped. Her body went rigid, the shock of it rooting her to the spot. She felt his breath on her neck, hot and humid, carrying the iron tang of blood and the raw musk of sweat. It was overwhelming, intimate, and absolutely terrifying. For a second, the world ceased to exist. There was only her and him. The line between them blurred into something she could not explain. Behind her, 1,000 lungs forgot to breathe. A tourist's phone slipped from nerveless fingers, falling into the dirt with a soft thud. Others froze mid-recording, their arms locked in place. A ranger lowered his net in disbelief. One woman gasped, but covered her own mouth instantly, as though afraid the sound alone might shatter the impossible moment. Dr. Melissa Carter's finger tightened on the tranquilizer trigger, then loosened again. Her chest rose and fell in astonishment, her scientific mind scrambling for an explanation but finding none. The horse should have lashed out. He should have bit and kicked. Anything but this. Samuel Hayes's voice cracked through the radio, barely more than a whisper. Jesus Christ, what the hell am I looking at? And no one answered. No one dared. The stillness was fragile, like glass, ready to break at the slightest pressure. The stallion remained there, with his mane draped against the ranger's shoulder, his massive head bowed in what looked like a gesture of acknowledgement. Claire's body shook with the aftermath of adrenaline, but she didn't flinch. She let him choose, let him linger, let him decide what came next. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the contact ended. Midnight drew back, his head lifted slowly, heavily, like a monarch reclaiming his throne. He blinked once, long and deliberate. Then, with a visible effort, he shifted his weight onto his injured leg. The freed hoof pressed to the ground, trembling under the weight, but it held. He took one step forward. He limped, the wound making him falter, but he did not collapse. His muscles bunched, his flanks rippled, and he found his balance. Slowly, painfully, he began to walk. Claire's eyes followed his every motion, her throat dry, her breath caught in her chest. The stallion paused just a few feet away. His head turned, his eyes finding hers one last time. And in that gaze, deep and unyielding, Claire felt the echo of the impossible moment they had just shared. Then he turned. Midnight's tail swished once, twice, cutting through the air like a black flag. His massive bulk shifted, his stride lengthening despite the limp. He walked away from her, away from the fence, each hoof fall leaving a bloody print in the dust. The sound of his steps grew fainter as he moved out onto the open plain, toward the vast, empty wilderness of the preserve. The crowd remained frozen in silence, watching him go. Only when the black stallion's silhouette finally merged with the tall grass did the spell begin to break. A baby cried, someone sobbed quietly. Another muttered, "I don't believe it." Claire still hadn't moved. She was still on her knees, her body trembling violently. The adrenaline that had carried her through the ordeal was now abandoning her all at once. Sweat soaked her back, plastering her shirt to her skin. Her hands were slick, the stallion's blood drying in dark, crusty stains across her palms. Her heart pounded against her ribs as though it would split them open. She stared after the fading figure, every nerve alight, her mind unable to process what had just transpired. The sound of the stallion's hooves echoed into the distance, a fading rhythm on the horizon. Claire inhaled shakily. In that moment, as the sun sank lower, painting the plains in fire and shadow, she understood that what had happened defied protocol, defied reason, and defied every warning that had screamed at her to turn back. This was more than survival, more than chance. It was something beyond every rule she had ever known. For a long while, Claire remained kneeling in the dust, staring at the fading silhouette of the stallion, as though afraid the vision would dissolve if she blinked. The spell broke when hands seized her arms. "Easy, we've got you," a ranger murmured, his voice soft with awe. Another slid a hand under her shoulder, steadying her as her knees buckled. Her legs felt like hollow reeds, trembling, ready to give way at the slightest touch. The adrenaline that had driven her into the storm had abandoned her all at once, leaving her hollow and raw. When she tried to stand on her own, her body refused. She swayed, nearly collapsing, and the rangers had to half carry her toward the medical station. Blood streaked her arms and hands, not hers, not all of it. Midnight's blood was drying, tacky and dark on her skin, smeared with the dust of the preserve. A shallow gash marked her right forearm where the barbed wire had caught her in her reckless dance with death. She barely felt it. The sting was nothing compared to the echo still thundering in her chest. The crowd behind the fence began to disperse slowly, reluctantly. Tourists walked away in hushed groups, their faces pale, their voices reverent. Some still clutched their phones, the video recordings glowing on their screens. Others just shook their heads as if they had just witnessed a miracle. I've never seen anything like that," one whispered to another. Inside the station, Claire was eased onto a narrow cot. The world swam in and out of focus. Her chest still heaved, her pulse still raced, but she couldn't shake the memory of that touch. The weight of a black mane brushing her shoulder, the impossible gentleness of that gesture. She had risked everything. By all rights, she should have been dead. And yet, here she was, alive, trembling, staring at her blood-stained hands. The door slammed open. Samuel Hayes stormed in like a thundercloud. His boots pounded against the floor, his face a furious shade of red. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck bulged, his eyes blazing with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at her. His voice was sharp, each word a blade. "You broke every single safety protocol we have." Claire sat rigid on the cot, her hands gripping the edges as though to anchor herself. Hayes advanced, slamming his palm against the table beside her. The sharp crack made the metal tray of instruments rattle. "You could have been killed," he roared. "Do you understand that? You could have died in front of dozens of visitors." "What then, Donovan? What would I tell their children as they watched you get trampled into the dirt?" His words tore through the small room, raw and scorching. Other staff shifted uneasily in the corners, no one daring to interrupt. Hayes leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this preserve? The liability, the lawsuits? We'd be ruined." Claire didn't answer at first. Her head hung, her chest rising and falling, with slow, steadying breaths. The fury in his words washed over her, but she didn't flinch. Finally, she lifted her gaze. Her voice was quiet, hoarse, but unshaken. "I couldn't watch him die." That was all she said. Hayes staggered back as though she had struck him. For a moment, a heavy silence filled the room, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent light overhead. His lips pressed into a thin, hard line. Her words should have sounded reckless, childish even, but they didn't. They were too simple, too honest. And worst of all, he knew she was right. Midnight had survived only because she had stepped in. He slammed a fist onto the table again, not in fury this time, but in sheer frustration. His rage had nowhere to go. The door opened once more. Dr. Melissa Carter entered, pulling a surgical mask down from her face. Stray strands of hair clung to her damp temples. She had been tending to Midnight, her gloves and scrubs streaked with crimson. Her eyes, though, held something different. Not anger, not even relief. Something closer to stunned disbelief. She removed her gloves, her voice steady but softer than usual. "In 15 years of veterinary medicine," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "I've never seen anything like what happened out there." Hayes turned toward her, seizing the lifeline. "Tell her, Carter. Tell her how insane this was. Tell her she nearly got herself killed." But Melissa didn't. She folded her arms across her chest, her eyes narrowing as she searched for the right words. Normally, in that state, injured, panicked, in pain, an animal like Midnight should have gone for the kill. Instinct would demand it. He should have lashed out, treated Claire as a threat. Her voice dropped. But he didn't. He did the exact opposite. A murmur swept through the small cluster of staff standing by. Hayes blinked, momentarily speechless. Melissa continued, her scientific mind clearly struggling to process the event. He not only refrained from harming her, he touched her. A gesture I can't explain scientifically. Not yet. She paused, the weight of the admission heavy in the air. That wasn't reflex. That wasn't instinct. That was something else. Claire swallowed hard. The words were both comforting and terrifying. She had felt it too. That's something else. Hayes dragged a hand down his face, muttering a curse. His anger was faltering, replaced by a deep unease. The certainty he wielded so easily was slipping from his grasp. Then another voice entered the fray. Sophie Lee had been silent until now, standing near the back with her ever-present camera bag slung over her shoulder. She stepped forward quietly, placing the bag on the table before opening her laptop. Without a word, she tapped a few keys, and the screen illuminated with a series of images. The room shifted, everyone drawn to the soft glow. The first photograph appeared, Claire kneeling in the dust, her cutters discarded, her hands empty. The next, Midnight, lowering his massive head, his mane cascading forward. And then the one that made the room still. The black stallion's forehead brushed against Claire's shoulder, her body trembling but unmoving, her eyes wide with awe. It was the exact instant no one had believed possible, frozen in time. The fury of the horse was gone, replaced by something deeper, something dangerously close to recognition. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Hayes couldn't find the words. Sophie's voice broke it, low but steady. If I hadn't taken these, no one would believe what we saw. She clicked again. The images rolled forward, showing the dust swirling like smoke, the faint tremor of Claire's shoulders, the way Midnight's body seemed to soften for just that one impossible moment. A ranger in the corner whispered, "It looks like a bow," or a nod. Others murmured in agreement, their voices hushed with reverence. Hayes exhaled heavily, collapsing into a chair, his anger completely drained away. His eyes never left the images on the screen, his jaw working as though chewing on words he couldn't force out. Finally, he turned back to Claire. His voice was lower now, stripped of its rage, carrying only the heavy weight of worry. "You understand," he said, "that none of this excuses your actions. You still broke every rule we live by." Claire nodded slowly. "I know." He rubbed his temples, groaning under the pressure. "You'll face disciplinary action. Suspension at the very least. You can't just walk away from this." Claire didn't argue. She didn't plead her case. Her eyes, instead, drifted back to the laptop screen where the photographs glowed. The moment replayed before her, undeniable, immortalized. To Hayes, it was evidence of a liability, of a danger they couldn't explain. To Melissa, it was a scientific anomaly that demanded study. To Sophie, it was a story the world needed to see. But to Claire, it was something else entirely. Not evidence, not proof. It was a reminder that in those impossible seconds, she and the wild had spoken in a language beyond rules, beyond fear, beyond reason. And no reprimand, no punishment could ever take that from her. Night fell quickly in Montana. By the time Claire left the infirmary, the sun had long since slipped behind the distant ridges, and the thinnest veil of fog rolled low across the grasslands. The world outside was a canvas of indigo and silver, the last hues of twilight fading as crickets began their evening chorus. The preserve was quieter now. No more shouting, no panicked tourists, only the hum of generators from the veterinary wing, the faint murmur of radios, and the chorus of insects filling the void left by the day's chaos. The air smelled faintly of dust, blood, and antiseptic. Inside the staff quarters, a small rustic building tucked against the main compound, the atmosphere was entirely different. The wooden walls glowed under the yellow light of an old oil lamp, shadows swaying lazily across the knotty pine. The scent of stale coffee hung in the air. Claire sat slouched in a chair, her arm bandaged, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in her hands. Across from her, Sophie Lee perched on the edge of a second chair, her laptop closed on the table before her. For once, the photographer didn't reach for her camera. She simply waited, as though sensing the fragile weight of what needed to be said. Claire stared out the small window into the darkness beyond. Her reflection wavered against the glass, superimposed over the faint glow of moonlight on the prairie. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, but burdened. "Midnight isn't just any horse," she said. Her fingers tightened on the mug. "He carries a past darker than most people can imagine." Sophie didn't interrupt. She opened a worn leather notebook instead, jotting a single word before setting her pen down. She leaned back, her eyes fixed on Claire, silent encouragement written on her face. "Everyone here knows he's dangerous," Claire continued. "They know he charges the fences, that he won't let handlers within 10 feet of him. But very few people know why. Very few understand what made him that way." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment the only sound was the rasp of insects outside. Then she drew in a deep breath and began. "It was in Nevada," she said, 3 years ago. Midnight was discovered in a raid on an illegal horse-fighting ring." Sophie's eyes narrowed. She had heard rumors of such brutal places, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a chill down her spine. "They called it a sport," Claire spat, bitterness leaking into her tone. "A spectacle for gambling men. They'd pit animals against each other in pits and makeshift arenas. Stallions, mares, even half-broken colts. All forced to fight until one couldn't stand anymore. Sometimes until one was dead." She stared down at her bandaged hand, tracing the edges of the gauze. Midnight was their champion. He was massive even then, larger than most draft breeds. He was the ace up their sleeve, the monster they'd unleash when the crowd wanted blood. Her voice grew softer, more distant, as though the memories weren't hers, but visions she had pieced together from reports, from scars, from the haunted look in the stallion's eyes. They kept him chained in a cell barely big enough for him to turn around. Heavy iron doors, concrete floors. He was let out only to fight. They would starve him just enough to keep him mean, beat him when he resisted, and reward him with scraps of food when he tore another animal apart. Sophie's stomach turned. She scribbled something in her notebook, but quickly closed it again, ashamed at the professional intrusion into such a personal, painful story. There was one story I'll never forget, Claire continued, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the wooden walls. A handler tried to push him back into his pen after a match. Midnight had won, but he was bleeding from his flank, limping. He snapped. They said he slammed his shoulder into the steel door so hard it bent the frame. He shattered the hinges. 3 men tried to subdue him. He sent all 3 to the hospital. After that, they doubled his chains, tightened the restraints until they carved into his skin, and still he fought. Claire's voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to continue. By the time authorities busted the place, he was half mad from pain and confinement. There were deep, old scars on his legs, welts across his back and his eyes. They glowed like embers in the dark. He didn't trust anyone. He couldn't. She paused, lifting the mug to her lips, though the coffee was long since cold. The taste was bitter, metallic on her tongue. When the fighting ring was dismantled, several horses were rescued. Most were broken, their ribs showing, their coats dull from neglect. But Midnight, he was something else. Bigger, stronger, wilder. The vets called him unmanageable. The other sanctuaries refused to take him. Too dangerous, they said, too unpredictable. One even suggested euthanasia. Sophie leaned forward, her breath catching. And that's when the preserve took him. Claire nodded. Montana Wilderness Preserve agreed to try. Some saw it as a challenge. Others, I think they just didn't want to admit defeat. But from the start, he was branded a monster, a lost cause. Her fingers trembled as she set the mug down on the table. He lived up to the reputation too. Attacked fences, broke through corrals, once nearly crushed a handler who got too close. Every interaction just reinforced the idea that he couldn't be saved. The lamplight flickered, the shadows stretching longer across the wooden floor. For a while, neither woman spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the ghosts of Nevada pits and the echoes of iron doors slamming shut. Then Claire's voice softened, breaking the stillness. But that's not all I saw. Sophie tilted her head. What do you mean? Claire's eyes glistened in the dim light. She looked at her bandaged arm, at the faint streaks of dried blood still under her nails. When I look at him, I don't just see violence. I see pain, years of it. A soul that's been tortured, beaten, and stripped of all trust. Her throat tightened. People see rage in his eyes. I see grief. For the first time since the chaos of the afternoon, Claire let the words fall without holding them back. That's why I couldn't walk away today. When I saw him tangled in that fence, bleeding, thrashing, I saw more than a dangerous horse. I saw an animal who had already been betrayed too many times, and I couldn't be one more person who left him to die. Her confession lingered in the quiet room, raw and unadorned. Sophie's hand stilled on her notebook. Slowly she closed it, letting the leather cover fall shut. Her eyes shone, not with pity, but with a deep, profound recognition. You realize, she said softly, that this is the heart of your story. Claire blinked. Story. The one I've been chasing since I came here, Sophie explained. Her voice was calm, almost reverent. Everyone thought this preserve was about conservation, about statistics, breeding programs, scientific reports. But what I saw today, what you just told me, that's more than data. That's the truth people need to hear. That beneath all the danger and the fury, there's something broken, something worth saving. Claire lowered her gaze. A single tear slipped free, trailing down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly, ashamed of the crack in her armor. Sophie didn't push. She simply leaned back, her expression softening. Thank you for trusting me with that, she said. Outside, a lone coyote called into the darkness. The sound drifted through the night, mournful and wild. Claire inhaled, steadying herself. Her heart still carried the echo of Midnight's touch, the impossible gentleness that had defied every warning. Now, layered on top of it, was the memory of everything he had endured. The pits, the chains, the betrayals. In that combination of past and present, she saw the truth of what she had risked her life for. Not to save a beast, but to reach a soul. And for the first time since the chaos began, Claire realized she had absolutely no regrets. The morning broke cool and sharp, sunlight spilling over the ridges of Montana and washing the grasslands in gold. The chaos of yesterday seemed like a distant fever dream, yet the entire preserve still pulsed with the echo of it. Staff spoke in hushed tones, their glances wary, as though the air itself might still shatter under the weight of what had happened. Midnight had been moved at dawn. The transport cage rattled across the compound, the stallion inside pacing like a caged storm. It took a small army of handlers, chains, and reinforced gates to maneuver him into the medical wing. Even sedated only lightly, he radiated a force that made every step perilous. But at last, with steel doors groaning shut behind him, Midnight was contained. The enclosure was built like a fortress, thick steel mesh, a floor layered with soft sand to protect his injured leg, and reinforced panels embedded with sensors. His front limb was bandaged carefully, the wound cleaned and treated. He lay stretched out in the dust, his flank rising and falling with heavy, labored breaths. His mane was tangled, streaked with dried sweat and blood, and his eyes fluttered half shut. But even in stillness, he looked like coiled lightning. Cameras blinked red from corners overhead. Remote monitors tracked his heart rate and respiration, projecting the data onto screens in the adjoining observation room. Everything about the setup screamed caution, science, distance. And yet, none of it prepared them for what happened next. Behind the one-way glass, Claire stood with Sophie Lee and Dr. Melissa Carter, her palms pressed against the cool frame, her eyes locked on the dark mass within the enclosure. Midnight stirred. Slowly, ponderously, he shifted his weight and pushed himself upright, his hooves scraping against the sand. His bandaged leg trembled but held. Then, without warning, his head swung around. His gaze fixed straight onto the glass, straight onto her. Claire froze. A chill coursed down her spine. Rationally, she knew it wasn't possible. The pain was mirrored from their side, opaque from his. He shouldn't have been able to see her. And yet, there was no mistaking it. He was looking at her. Not past her, not at some vague shape or shadow. At her. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs, her fingers clenched into tight fists. She felt her breath hitch as if the air itself had thickened. Midnight's ears flicked forward, his nostrils flared. And then a sound emerged from deep within his chest, a soft, low whicker. It wasn't the scream of fury she had heard yesterday. It wasn't the roar of defiance that rattled fences. It was gentler, weak, yes, but undeniably deliberate, like a greeting. "Oh my God," Sophie whispered. Her camera was already in her hands, but it trembled as she lifted it, the lens quivering against the glass. The shutter clicked once, twice, the sound absurdly small against the enormity of the moment. Claire's throat tightened. She pressed a palm against the barrier as though she could bridge the distance, as though she could step across that impossible line between human and wild. Melissa Carter, ever the pragmatist, staggered back a step. Her eyes were wide with a disbelief that cracked through her professional calm. It recognizes you," she said, her voice hushed, as though speaking louder might undo the moment. Claire tore her gaze from the stallion only long enough to look at the veterinarian. "That's not possible, right? You said the glass." "It isn't." Melissa cut her off. She shook her head, one hand hovering in the air as though reaching for an explanation that wasn't there. One-way glass. Ventilation designed to carry scent away. Every safeguard to keep the animal from making that connection. She gestured helplessly toward the steel chamber. "And yet, he found you anyway." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Melissa Carter was not a woman prone to exaggeration or fancy. For 15 years, she had lived by data, by clinical certainty. And yet the sight before her made her voice falter. I don't know how to explain this." Midnight's gaze never wavered. His breath fogged faintly in the cool morning air, his bandaged leg trembling as he bore his weight, but his attention was absolute. Claire's pulse hammered. She could feel it in her fingertips, in her throat, in the fragile, breathless space between them. The door to the observation room banged open. Samuel Hayes stepped in, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the data screens. He froze when he saw the stallion pressed against the far side of the enclosure, staring unwaveringly toward the glass. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Melissa straightened, folding her arms as though bracing herself. "He's fixated on Claire." Hayes scoffed. "Fixated? He can't even see her. He's probably reacting to a movement or a light. Horses do that all the time." "No," Sophie said firmly. Her voice carried none of its usual journalistic detachment. It was quiet but certain, as though backed by an unshakable truth. She raised her camera slightly, gesturing toward the images frozen on her screen. "This isn't random. This isn't reflex. This is deliberate attention. He knows she's there." Hayes's frown deepened. "Or he thinks she's there." Claire didn't speak. She couldn't. Her eyes remained locked with Midnight's, her breath shallow. It felt less like observation and more like a silent communion. An invisible thread stretched taut between them. The stallion shifted his weight, lowering his head slightly. His nostrils flared again. A low rumble in his chest reverberated through the room's speakers, a sound too close to recognition to be dismissed. Hayes rubbed his temples, frustration radiating off him. He was a man who lived by order, protocol, predictability. This was none of those things. And yet, even he couldn't look away. By noon, a meeting was convened. The small conference room smelled of coffee and stress. Melissa Carter stood at the head of the table, flanked by Sophie with her laptop and Hayes glowering with his arms folded. Claire sat at the far end, silent, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Melissa cleared her throat. "What we witnessed this morning is unprecedented. Midnight's reaction to Claire cannot be dismissed as coincidence." Hayes barked a laugh. "Unprecedented is one word. Reckless is another. If you think I'm going to let her walk into that pen after what happened yesterday—" "I'm not suggesting direct contact," Melissa interrupted sharply. "I'm suggesting a controlled trial. Barriers in place, full veterinary oversight, a tranquilizer team on standby. But if what we saw was real, we have to investigate." A look of awe crept into her voice. "The implications, they're staggering." Sophie leaned forward, opening her laptop and spinning it toward Hayes. A series of images flashed across the screen, Midnight's eyes locked on the glass, Claire's hand pressed against it. The stallion's body language softened in ways no camera had ever captured before. "This isn't random," Sophie said again. "You can see it. He's choosing her." Hayes's jaw worked, but he didn't respond immediately. His gaze lingered on the photographs, and for the briefest moment the hardness in his eyes faltered. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it on my terms. Reinforced barriers, teams ready to intervene. And the second that horse shows a hint of aggression, it's over." Melissa nodded. "Agreed." Her eyes shifted toward Claire, her expression softening. "Are you willing?" Claire swallowed. Her mouth was dry, her pulse still racing from the morning's encounter. She thought of the touch of Midnight's mane on her shoulder, the impossible moment that had brought her here. Her answer was quiet, but steady. Yes. The decision was made. The next morning, under the strictest protocols imaginable, they would test the bond between Ranger and Stallion. For the first time, science itself would stand aside to see if trust, impossible, irrational, unthinkable trust, could be real. The dawn that followed was no ordinary dawn. A hush blanketed the preserve, as though even the prairie grass and the circling hawks sensed that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Staff gathered with clipboards, radios, and tranquilizer rifles. The air was cool, heavy with anticipation. By mid-morning, the medical enclosure had been transformed into a stage. A double-layered steel fence ringed the sandy arena. Cameras glinted from every angle, their lenses trained on the dark mass inside. Veterinary monitors beeped softly, broadcasting Midnight's pulse. Armed personnel stood at intervals, dart rifles raised, fingers hovering just shy of the triggers. Claire Donovan waited just beyond the barrier, her boots rooted in the dirt. She had been briefed twice over: stand still, maintain distance, do not approach. Every precaution screamed restraint. But as she looked across the compound at the stallion, a current ran beneath her skin, something stronger than fear, stronger than protocol. The gates clanged open, and Midnight stepped into the arena. He was magnificent, his coat glistening black under the Montana sun, his mane a tangled storm. The bandage on his leg was fresh, the limp faint but present. Yet none of it dimmed his presence. He was power incarnate, a living shadow cut against the bright light. Every voice around the arena hushed, radios crackled and went silent. Then Claire entered the observation zone. A 10-meter gulf stretched between her and the fencing, a deliberate moat of safety. She inhaled the dry air, stinging her lungs, and forced her steps to remain steady. The reaction was immediate. Midnight lifted his head, his ears pricking forward. His amber eyes locked onto her as though no one else in the world existed. Dozens of handlers, scientists, and guards stood within his sight, yet he looked right through them all. His gaze landed on Claire, sharp and unyielding. He moved. The sand crunched beneath his hooves as he advanced, one deliberate step at a time. The tension in the crowd tightened like a drawn bowstring. Rifles rose an inch higher, but there was no fury in his stride, no wild thrashing, no murderous rage. His head was high, his gait purposeful, each step measured. He closed the distance until the fence loomed only a few meters away. Then he stopped, and he bowed. A hoof struck the sand with a weighty thud, his massive body lowering until one knee touched the earth. The sound reverberated through the silence like a drumbeat. Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. The black stallion knelt. The gesture was unmistakable, an echo of deference, of recognition, of something beyond any human vocabulary. The arena was silent, save for the faint hiss of wind through the wires. Claire's chest tightened. Her knees wobbled, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming understanding. She drew in a breath and mirrored him. Slowly, deliberately, she sank down to the earth, pressing her palms into the dirt, lowering herself until she was kneeling in his line of sight. Her eyes never left his. The air thickened, charged. The two figures, woman and stallion, faced one another in a reflection so perfect it defied all logic. It was not trainer and animal, not predator and prey, but equals, meeting in some silent exchange that neither language nor science could yet name. The shutter of Sophie Lee's camera clicked like distant thunder. Frame after frame, she captured the impossible tableau. A ranger kneeling before a horse bowing before a human. A guard muttered under his breath, "God Almighty, it's like they're speaking." No one dared to disturb the moment. Even Hayes, his fists clenched white around his radio, couldn't bring himself to shout. For a span of heartbeats, the world contracted to a circle of silence, broken only by the steady breathing of a woman and a beast who should have been enemies, but weren't. Dr. Eleanor Wright had traveled from the University of Montana specifically for this. She had read the reports, seen Sophie's first photographs, and listened to Carter's clinical notes. None of it had prepared her for the reality. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper of reverence. This isn't reflex. This isn't mimicry. This is recognition. Melissa Carter glanced at her sharply. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," Wright continued, her eyes locked on the kneeling figures, "that this stallion is acknowledging intent. He understands that she comes without threat. He's mirroring not just her posture, but her purpose." She turned to Hayes, her words quickening with conviction. "Horses in the wild communicate through body language, submission, greeting, alliance. But never, never in the recorded literature has a wild or feral stallion mirrored this to a human. We are watching something new." Hayes muttered a curse under his breath, shaking his head as though the weight of her words was too much to bear. But his eyes betrayed him. He was watching as intently as everyone else. At last, Claire rose slowly to her feet. Her knees trembled, her breath uneven. Midnight remained motionless for a moment longer, then lifted himself with a grunt of effort. Dust fell from his coat as he straightened, his eyes never leaving her. The rifles lowered one by one. Held breaths were released. A wave of relief swept the compound like a sigh of wind. Midnight stepped back, calm and deliberate. He turned in a slow circle, his tail flicking once, then retreated to the far end of the pen. The spell was broken, but its echo lingered in every chest. Sophie dropped her camera to her lap, staring at the images she had just captured. She knew without a doubt that these frames would change the world. Claire walked stiffly out of the observation zone, her heartbeat still thundering in her ears. She felt as though she had touched a thread between worlds, a line of communication too fragile for language, yet too strong to deny. That afternoon, the conference room was packed. The emergency board meeting buzzed with tension. Hayes sat at the head of the table, his shoulders hunched like a man carrying too much weight. Beside him, Carter leafed through notes, her brow furrowed, but her eyes bright. Wright stood near a whiteboard, her arms crossed, her expression alive with scientific fervor. Sophie leaned against the wall, her laptop ready, the glow of her captured images still fresh in her mind. Hayes began with a growl. "Let's cut to it. What happened this morning may look impressive, but it could have been chance, coincidence, a fluke of body language. I will not have this preserve turned into a circus because one ranger wants to play horse whisperer." Melissa Carter leaned forward, her palms flat against the table. "With all due respect, Sam, I saw it too. I've spent 15 years working with horses, wild and domestic. That wasn't coincidence. He should have treated Claire as a threat. Instead, he engaged her. That distinction is everything." Hayes's jaw tightened. "Or it's everything we want to see. You ever think of that?" Eleanor Wright cut in before Carter could answer, her voice steady and commanding. "I am telling you, as a scientist, this is significant. Recognition of intent has been studied in primates, dolphins, elephants, but never in equines, and certainly not in an animal as traumatized as Midnight. If we document this correctly, it could redefine our understanding of horse cognition." The room buzzed with murmurs. A board member shifted uneasily. Another tapped his pen against the table. Hayes rubbed his temples. "Or it could redefine us as fools if she ends up trampled." Silence followed. Wright's gaze softened, but her words carried steel. "Every breakthrough begins with risk. You keep Midnight locked up, you prove nothing. You let us test this further, under the strictest conditions, and we may open a door science has never walked through before." The air in the room grew heavy. Hayes exhaled, long and weary. His anger had faded to something else, fear, laced with a reluctant awe. At last, the decision was made. The board voted, narrowly and tensely, to attempt a monitored reintroduction. Midnight would be released back into his range. Claire would be present, but confined to a reinforced vehicle, never closer than 50 meters. Cameras would cover every angle. Veterinary and security teams would stand ready. It was a compromise, a gamble, a chance to test the impossible under conditions just safe enough to keep fear at bay. Hayes's voice sealed the verdict. "I don't like this," he said, his tone rough, his eyes shadowed with resignation, "but I'll allow it. Not because I believe in fairy tales, but because I refuse to let decisions be made on speculation alone. We'll prove this one way or the other." The meeting adjourned. Claire stepped out into the hallway, her pulse still humming with the memory of that morning. Behind her, Sophie caught up, whispering, "You know, don't you? Tomorrow isn't just about Midnight. It's about whether we're brave enough to believe what we saw." Claire didn't answer. She only looked out the window toward the golden grasslands, where a black silhouette still haunted her every thought. Tomorrow the truth would be tested, and the world would be watching. Dawn bled gently into the prairie, a thin gold seam along the horizon that widened with every passing minute. The grass of Montana looked frosted under a veil of low silver mist, each blade beaded with cold dew that caught the first light and scattered it in tiny, brilliant shards. The preserve felt different at this hour, empty and reverent, as if the land itself had agreed to whisper while something important took place. Engines idled softly. A reinforced truck sat 40 meters from a temporary corral, its steel sides dulled by years of dust and sun. Another boxy vehicle, its glass slit with armored grills, waited beside a cluster of tripods shouldering long telephoto lenses. Cables snaked to battery packs. A boom mic hovered like a curious bird over a field of muted voices. No one spoke above a murmur. They were all aware that the line between a good plan and a catastrophe was as thin as the mist that stitched the low places together. "Dart team status," someone radioed. "Ready, dosage prepped." "On your mark, cameras are rolling," another voice said, hushed as if afraid the air might shatter. "All angles covered." Inside the armored observation vehicle, Claire Donovan watched her breath cloud the window and vanish. She sat forward in the bucket seat, her hands braced at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, though the engine was off. She wasn't moving, but her knees were already locked with tension. The transport pen dominated her view, a heavy steel trailer backed against a temporary chute and gate. Beyond the pen, the world opened up. Miles of ochre grass rolling toward a stitched line of cottonwoods and the distant glint of a river. Her heart hadn't slowed since they'd left the compound. She told herself to breathe. Her fingers ignored her. Across the way, she could see Dr. Melissa Carter standing beside a tech, a clipboard in her hand, a headset tight over her hair. The vet's face held that focused calm she wore like a uniform, but even from this distance, Claire could see the telltale crease between her brows. A soft knock at the side window made Claire glance left. Sophie Lee stood a few feet away, her camera harnessed across her chest, the big lens capped for now. Claire pushed a switch, and the glass hummed down an inch. "You okay?" Sophie asked. "Yes," Claire lied. Sophie angled a look toward the trailer. "You'll stay in the vehicle." Claire didn't answer. She didn't have to. Sophie blew out a thin breath, gave a single tight nod, and drifted back to her mark, her hands already lifting to check the light. A shadow crossed the mist. Samuel Hayes strode into view, a headset clamped over his ears, his posture that familiar combination of wary and stubborn. He stopped in front of Claire's hood and pointed two fingers at his own eyes, then rotated his wrist. "Stay put." She gave him a thumbs up. He tapped the headset. "Mic down. All teams stand by," Hayes said. "Open the trailer on my count. 3, 2, 1, open." Metal clanged, a bright, decisive sound that cracked the morning's quiet. Latches popped. The gate's weight shifted with a grunt of hinges and then swung wide. From the darkness within, midnight appeared. The stallion filled the doorway like a storm cloud. He paused, his head high, his nostrils flaring to sift the scents of the morning. The dew, the cold metal, the mud and sage, the specter of every human within 100 feet. Sun caught the planes of his face, the wet shine of his muzzle, the ragged texture where wind had combed dried sweat into the edges of his mane. He stepped down, one hoof and then another, his bandaged leg clean, the limp nearly erased. He seemed larger than in memory, as if the days inside had condensed his power rather than drained it. The hush held. A hawk screamed far off, the sound carrying forever. Midnight stood and breathed the land. He tilted his head to take in the hills, like a man would draw a familiar room back into himself. His chest expanded, the exhale slow and decisive, a claim on the morning. Someone near the dart team whispered, "There he is," as though naming a god. Then he looked. Not at the open prairie, not at the cameras, not at the line of armed men, but toward the row of vehicles, and the one window where a woman sat rigid in a grey shirt, her eyes wide. Dr. Carter leaned toward her engineer, her voice barely audible. He's looking for her." Hayes's jaw worked. "Everyone hold. If he charges, we abort. Darts up." The rifles inclined a fraction. Midnight didn't charge. He didn't move at all. He stared at the truck with the intensity of stone. Inside the vehicle, Claire's knuckles blanched. She heard Hayes crackle through the radio sitting on her dashboard. "Donovan, you remain in that seat. Do you copy?" Claire swallowed. "Copy," she said, though the word caught in her throat. The silence stretched. It had weight. It had edges. It pressed on the bones of everyone who had come to witness what could not be described. Midnight tossed his head once, as if to fold away a thought. He set off, slow at first, then with a measure that felt like a decision, toward the vehicles, toward the truck where Claire sat locked in place. "Hold position," Hayes said. "Do not exit. That is a direct order." Claire's breath shortened to little uneven pieces. He kept coming. "You promised," she told herself. "You said you'd stay in the truck. It's safer for him if you do. It's safer for everyone. Trust the plan. Midnight stopped again, closer now. The heat of him made the dew bloom into mist at his feet. He didn't flare into rage. He simply waited. Something opened somewhere behind Claire's ribs, a movement she felt more than she chose. Her hand went to the door handle before she even realized it had moved at all. "Donovan." Hayes' voice had the rasp of ground glass. "Hold your position. Do not exit." The handle was cold. Her palm was warm, the world compressed to the thickness of steel between her and the open air. "I hear you," she whispered. The latch clicked. The door swung open with a sigh, and cold air poured into the cab. Grass brushed her boots as she stepped down, the hem of her pant leg collecting dew. "Return to the vehicle now," Hayes shouted, and even the hawk seemed to pause on a wing. "That is an order." Claire's foot found the earth. Her next one found it too. The dart rifles rose, sight lines shifting like a set of compass needles finding north. Sophie's lens cap was already off. She lifted her camera into the crook of her shoulder and tracked Claire across the short distance, her own breath shallow. Claire didn't run. She didn't raise her hands or call out. She walked into the day like someone stepping across a threshold she had been approaching for years, as if her entire life had pressed her gently here, to this patch of cold grass where breath made fog and the world was about to choose what it would be. Midnight saw her. He moved again, the great head lowering, the long neck flexing as he adjusted to her presence. The space between them thinned with each step until there was almost none left at all. 5 meters, 4, 3. The quiet became fragile. People's hearts began to sound like drums inside their own chests, and each drum demanded the same thing. "Don't break." Midnight stopped. He stood taller than her by more than a head, his chest a wall of muscle, his shadow wide enough to cover her boots. Heat rolled off him in waves. His breath came loud and heavy, fragrant with grass, with iron, with something like rain. Claire lifted her hand. It shook. She held her palm out, open and empty, her fingers loose, the line of her arm a careful bridge. For a fraction of a second so thin it might have been no time at all, nothing happened. Then the stallion tipped the axis of his world by the slightest degree. His forehead lowered, his muzzle dipped. The fine whiskers at the edge of his lips quivered. He touched her hand, not a shove, not a push, not force. A press no heavier than a nod. The soft hair along his brow brushed her skin, coarse and hot, and a warm breath burst against her palm. The contact traveled through her, a current leaping from skin to tendon to bone to find something behind her sternum that sparked and held. Someone made a sound like a prayer. Another made a sound like losing it. No one moved. Midnight lifted his head and in the same heartbeat threw it back. The sound he gave the morning ripped it open, one long ringing call that ricocheted off the hills and made the mist lift in shreds. A stallion's claim and a benediction, both at once. Then he wheeled. He didn't spring like a colt. He ran as if the ground belonged to him again, as if the muscles that had learned cages had remembered distance and the meaning of it. The dew exploded under his hooves, turning to silver spray. He surged across the grass and broke into the open like a dark sail catching a full wind. The field detonated into human sound, gasps, cheers, the staccato rattle of shutters, the buzz of a dozen phones held high. Someone laughed, someone sobbed. Dart rifles lowered, shoulders sagged, and more than one pair of knees turned shaky in the sudden, stunning truth that they had survived the moment they'd all sworn would kill someone. Claire stood alone in the patch of flattened dew. Her hand still remembered the heat. Her chest still remembered the sound. "Jesus," Hayes said into the radio, but there was no anger in it now, only the kind of awe that doesn't like to admit itself aloud. Sophie had not stopped shooting. She tracked Midnight until the stallion was a sleek punctuation mark in the far grasses, and then pivoted back to Claire, her elbows tucked, breathing in time with her shutter. "Hold," she murmured, as if to the light itself. "Hold, please hold." By noon, the first image had left her camera and entered 1,000 private universes. By dusk, it had appeared on the front page of 2 national outlets and a dozen local ones. By midnight, it had perched on the trending bar of the largest social platforms and begun to cross languages, stripped down to the essential geometry of what it showed. A woman with an open hand, a stallion lowering his crown to meet it. Headlines tried to trap the moment in words. She should have died. Instead, this happened. The Montana miracle, between wild and human. A bridge. Comment sections filled with arguments and awe, with anger and wonder, with people seeing what they needed to see and changing their minds about what was possible. Scientists began to draft emails with subject lines like preliminary impressions and requesting raw footage. A lab on another continent wrote the phrase recognition of intent with a question mark that didn't feel like a question at all. And the preserve, its accounts accustomed to slow seasons, saw its numbers rise. But the images were only half the story, and stories do not end in a single day. The seasons moved. Months later, the late afternoon light pulled warm and long along the ridges, a thicker gold than the brittle dawn of the release. The grass had turned paler where the wind combed it often, and the river's voice carried farther on cool days like this. Claire stood on a low knoll with Sophie beside her, both of them wearing the easy quiet of people who have learned to share silence without feeling the need to fill it. Binoculars lifted to Claire's face, her breath stilled. "There," she said. Sophie raised her camera out of reflex, following the line of Claire's chin. They came from the west, a ribbon of motion unspooling over a hill, the sun lighting their edges so that each horse carried a smouldering outline. The band swept down and arranged itself the way such things arrange when they have done it 1,000 times. Stallion ahead and a little to the side, mares and yearlings behind. The whole group a living, breathing pattern with every stride. The leader's mane flew like a banner, so black it seemed to drink the light. Midnight. They halted at a distance you could measure in dozens of strides, but not in meaning. Wind lifted the long hair at their fetlocks. Tails swished for a few beats. Nothing else moved. Even the sound of the wind held still. Midnight looked up the slope. The angle of his head did not change. The set of his ears did not change. But something did. It was as fine as a breath, yet as large as thunder. Claire lowered the binoculars and let her hands rest against the curve of the hill. The stallion gave a low call, not a challenge, not a claim, but a note with space inside it, and several ears flicked among the mares. He stepped forward one pace and then stopped as if to say, "This is close enough." The band waited as if to say, "We know." "Do you see it?" Sophie asked softly. "Yes," Claire said, and the word felt like a place rather than a noise. Her pulse had picked up without asking permission. She listened to it, and then to the quiet, and then to the river, and then to all the pieces together. Midnight raised his head, turned, and sent another call rolling across the slope. It traveled like a hand smoothed down a rumpled sheet. Everything after it lay flatter, calmer, clearer. Then he turned away, set his shoulder, and the band moved with him as one unit, the sound of their hooves a drum line that receded into the distance, and then into memory. Sophie let her camera hang for a while. Neither of them talked. At last she said, almost to the wind, "People were certain you'd die if you helped him." But the unthinkable happened. Claire smiled, a small private thing, her eyes still on the place where the band had vanished. "It wasn't unthinkable," she said. "It was just something we hadn't learned to believe in yet." Sophie looked at her, and then at the plane, and then at the sky, and nodded once, as if to mark something finished that wasn't really a finish at all. They stood there, their shadows growing longer now, and the grass made its old sound, soft, dry, and as old as any promise. If there was a last image, it belonged not to a camera, but to a patient gaze. The herd, far off, went from horses to shapes, to dark commas moving along the vast page of the prairie. The light lowered, grew heavier, and slid along the spine of the country until even the river became only a thought of silver. Somewhere out there, Midnight threw up his head and sang to the coming dark, and the echo made the day sound larger than it had been. Between that sound and the two figures on the knoll, something unseen held, stout as a rope and fine as a hair. A bridge, perhaps, or a thread, or only the new habit of believing in what you've touched with your own hand. Either way, it spanned the distance, and the country, deep-breathed and watchful, kept it. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out, hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.